Hello.
Hello, everybody. We will start in just a moment. My name's Lucy. I think I know a few of you already. I'm recognising some faces. I'm going to be hosting today. Just let you know, we are recording, so if you don't want your face in the recording, that's fine. Just turn your camera off. And yeah, we'll just give people a few more minutes and then we'll get started. I was going to start at 5 past, but I feel like we may as well start because I can't see anyone else joining. So I'm just going to start. So hello, everybody, and welcome to our panel today. My name is Lucy, as I said before, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Birmingham. And today's panel talk is hosted by the Midlands Network of Popular Culture. And we're going to have two people speaking today. So we've got Pauline Suwanban and Ali Williams. And Pauline, do you want to kick us off and get started? Pauline is at the University of Birkbeck and she's doing her research on romance and Orientalism, and that's what she's going to be talking on today.
Thanks, Lucy. Just going to share my screen. Just waiting for it to get on the slideshow. For some reason, it doesn't want to do it.
Just while we're waiting, if you have any questions, we are going to have a Q&A after both talks, but feel free to put any questions or comments in the chat as the talks are happening and we're going along.
Sorry, just bear with me.
That's all right.
I think it's frozen, sorry. Can you just give me 1 second?
That is absolutely fine. I'll fill it in by talking, I guess. So yeah, I don't know now what to say to fill in the time. Does anyone have any questions before we get started? I'm happy to answer any questions about how it's going to work or anything like that. No, I'm just getting lots of, tell us about the MIDS-POP group. Okay, so the MIDS-POP group is basically a network across the Midlands, based mainly in Birmingham. And what we do is we try to promote popular culture and the study of popular culture, both kind of that's happening within the Midlands, but also bringing experts to the Midlands to talk and things like that. We obviously do popular culture, so it's quite wide ranging. Obviously, this event is on romance, previous events have been on sci-fi, we've had events on autism, all sorts of things, just anything really to do with popular culture, game science, film, books, TV, all sorts. Our next event, Dan, what is our next event that's happening? Sorry, I've been a bit out of the loop recently, so I don't know, but Dan knows.
Our next event will be an international speaker whose name we're keeping under wraps because we haven't got one yet. Yes, look forward to that. I've got links in the chat below if you'd like to look at the website or the video archive to see what we've been up to.
Yeah, so we, as Dan said, we do record all our talks. So if there's anything that's interesting, you go onto our website. We've had quite a few now. We've been going about a year. I don't think we've had any other romance things recorded, but we did have Lisa Fletcher talk. She didn't talk on romance, but she did talk. And then some of the Q&A questions did involve romance. So that is up if people want to go and see that. So yeah, are we good to go, Pauline?
Yes, thank you, Lucy. Sorry, I just had to, I think it froze and I just had to redo it. Okay, let me just try to get this up again. Okay, great. Is that okay for everybody? Great, thank you. Okay, so thanks, Lucy. So my project is titled Popular Romance and Orientalist Fantasy. And as it states, my mission is to prove that there's a connection between the two, especially with the development of romance as a genre. So before I go into this, I should probably explain how I define these two terms. So what is romance? So the romance novel has had, as some of you already really know, a long and complicated history. It's best known by its infamy, like popular culture in general, I think, disregarded as lowbrow because it has had such mass appeal. And trying to describe it can be quite tricky because it's existed in various forms before it's taken shape into the way we understand it today. And I agree that it certainly emerged in the 20th century as a distinct category of publishing and readership. And on the whole, I agree that there are two main signifiers. They are stories that focus on the love of two people and end with their happy union. And I also agree that it imagines the ways that popular love and desire might serve as a path to self-fulfillment and increasingly social political equality. And I'm quoting from the recently published research companion to romance, which has been such a godsend. And I wish it was published 2 years ago when I was trying to write my own introduction and pulling my hair and trying to define something that was just basically based on how I feel, which wasn't coming across on paper. Yeah, so but what's important to me, which I think is unique to the genre, is that it deeply cares about pleasure, about the pleasure of the reader or assumed reader, which for the purpose of my history is cisgendered, heterosexual and female, and that's the framework my research will be taking. And I think Ali will go into more ideas on how the genres become more progressive and how we can all become a bit more inclusive in researching and teaching romance as well. There's also a really good summary of definitions in the Teach Me Tonight blog, which is run by very amazing leading scholars of romance. So how does Orientalism come into this? So any mention of the term, which my supervisor kind of hates me doing, but we have to start with Edward Said's definitions and his foundation text published in 1978. Which highlights the politically motivated, mainly male depictions of the Eastern world as weak, inferior, and effeminate. And he references the East as North Africa and the Middle East more than Asia, but I feel like I understand it as a way of thinking about one large, vague, faraway, generic fantasy. And he also compares the control of Eastern societies to the Western male domination of Eastern women. And for me, I've been interested in how women writers have interpreted what the term and what we call the other, which is much more complicated. And I feel that there's an objectification of its material beauty, luxury, but at the same time a vulnerability and perverse enjoyment of its backwardness and violence. And there's been a lot of research on this, especially on the concept of feminist Orientalism, which emerged in the 18th century. And it means in which racial stereotypes are used to argue the state of female equality at home. So Mary Wollstonecraft's comments in her Vindication is actually quite a good example of this. And in her introduction, she describes oppressed women as weak beings only fit for the seraglio. Can they govern a family or take care of the poor babes who they bring into the world? And so it's to say these women are fit for nothing. And the seraglio, it's a private section of the house for women in a typical Ottoman household. And like the harem has been over-sexualized throughout the years and associated with mindless servitude. Wollstonecraft also criticizes women who read novels with sentimental jargon, or what she calls female follies, which I find really hilarious, as weak-minded. So how are the two connected? So the image of the reputedly weak female reader brings us back to the root I'm trying to unearth, because I believe pleasure in romance is somehow tangled in ideas about and fantasies about the foreign and different. And this definitely revolves around the romance hero and his relationship to the heroine. There's another concept in romance that's not part of the official definition, but I feel it's been intrinsic to how it grew and became popular, and still has a reputation today, and that's the theme of sexual danger, how it feeds into creating female pleasure, and it's always criticized. Romance readers and scholars, or both, have been plagued by the question, why does the theme of sexual danger exist? Because I guess to even consider it as a question requires a certain feminist assumption that the genre can't be and must not be truly pleasurable, if that's the case. So this hero figure is both fearful and at the same time an object of desire, with a hidden ability to transform into a loving, committed partner. So he's at times both the villain and the hero. And if you're not familiar with romance novels, you would have probably heard about the bad press surrounding such a figure. And we're fortunate to have much more varied, diverse heroes in recent years, but I think the dangerous lover, the devil husband, attractive antagonist was a significant part of how erotic desire was defined. And I was at a really interesting talk yesterday hosted by the University of Birmingham and their reading group on romance about the sexualization of Jack the Ripper and serial killers, which has given me another layer to this as well, which has been really interesting. So Carol Dillhouse, in her History of Heartthrobs, describes this man as always brooding, nursing injured sensitivities and dark passions. And just by this very commonly used adjective, dark, in the really commonly used phrase, tall, dark strangers, which I really don't know where it's from. Hopefully we'll stop using it. I think we can shift to thinking about race. So I believe that 18th to 19th century fantasies of the Orient and everything that was considered under the sun non-European or non-Western played some part in creating this desirable but frightening hero figure, and that he definitely recurs throughout time. I believe he's an ancient figure with mythical fairy tale origins, starting with animal bridegroom tales. And many scholars discuss the connection between romance and the Beauty and the Beast plot, and which is definitely not unfounded. Animal bridegroom tales, potentially beginning with the myth Cupid and Psyche, to the French beast tales such as Beauty and the Beast, focus on female sacrifice and pleasurable reward, and the heroine's happy ending in discovering the inner goodness and superiority of the beastly lover. So fairy tales in France and Britain had a joint flourishing with Oriental literature and fashions, especially the popularity of Arabian Nights, which was firstly translated into French by Antoine Galland in 1704. And this was followed by many other really popular French and English variations. And one well-known offspring is the eponymous villain of Charles Perrault's Bluebeard. It's quite a good example of this intersection between the two figures, because he's been compared to the Sultan from Arabian Nights and also represented as a Turkish man in early artworks. And also, as it happens, Perrault and Galland had the same publisher. Their works were discussed together, so I think they definitely influenced each other. Historian Linda Coley also explains that the decline of the Ottoman Empire during the 18th century could have contributed to the emergence of this scary, lusty Oriental figure and his threat to white women rather than men. So in terms of the text I'm looking at, I start off with 18th century writers Eliza Haywood and Penelope Ogden, who were very prolific and popular in the time, and potentially the first romance writers. I focus on the theme of captivity and the Orient as its expressive temptation, but always a place to return from and learn from. And they both stress Western female mastery over the backwardness of the other, as well as the tension between material beauty and sexual danger. So this idea of beauty but backwardness, as I mentioned before. I also look at the Gothic texts, by Charlotte Dacre called Sophia, which is about the seduction of an aristocratic Italian woman by a manservant who's also a Moor, or described as a Moor, and then he's eventually revealed as Satan, and he kills the heroine. So here the figure of the Oriental beast is considered an invasion, disease, but potentially an opportunity for liberation in the story, even if it ends quite badly. So this leads to my research on the early 20th century phenomenon of desert romances, which was an incredible trend during the interwar years in books, magazines, and cinema and fashion. And this is also when the plot from these previous writers seems to have sort of a turning point. The Sheikh, which was published in 1919, kickstarted this whole trend, and which was starting before, but I think this was when it really truly was exposed. It's about an English woman who falls in love with a Sheikh, is kidnapped by him, and then falls in love with him. She doesn't, it's a story when she travels there, but she falls in love, but she doesn't die or return from there, unlike the previous writers. And yeah, lives happily ever after. I guess I feel like there's a sneaky sort of suspicious desire of the other, which has sort of been building up until this moment and has become a reality, especially during when the romance genre is taking shape as we understand it today. So before I finish, I just wanted to share some thoughts on a new case study and share it with you guys. I've recently been thinking about the history of women's magazines. I feel like it's had the same reputation as romance novels, and it's tied with pleasurable reading. So I've started to compare the 18th century publication of the Ladies' Magazine with the late 20th century magazine My Story Weekly, which both feature Oriental tales. The Ladies' Magazine was hugely popular, and although it's really difficult to know its complete audience. So it marked the departure from the authoritative periodical essays of prior women's magazines to content about feminine knowledge. It represented a shift from society to domestic attention to female pleasure or leisure. I'm quoting from Jenny Batchelor and Ros Ballister, who have been leaders in this field. So the Ladies' Magazine, it has so many different types of Oriental tales, really short stories, not just romances, but moral tales as well, and interlaced with other stories, translations, and letters. And I feel like the biggest reason for the Oriental tales is probably the popularity of the Arabian Nights at the time, and I feel like it's just somehow become unquestionable everyday content. But not much has really been said about this yet. So the first Oriental tale it has is called, Generous Prince, an Eastern Tale, and it's set near Damascus, and it's about a young slave woman who is betrothed to a rich merchant's son, but kidnapped into another household. She's eventually saved and let go to be with her husband, so it's a happy end. And then My Story Weekly, I came across when researching desert romances, so I have the modernist scholar Laura Frost to thank for discovering this. So it started in 1927, and riding off the trend of the Sheikh, it had serials that imitated the best-selling novel. The first issue started off with one called How I Was Loved by a Sheikh. It's also set in Damascus, which I thought was quite interesting, where a young woman travels with her dancing group and almost has a relationship with the Sheikh, who just became obsessed with her when seeing her dancing. And it's supposed to have been written by the woman herself, Irene Speller, but I think could be anonymous, or just made up by the editors. So here, I think the story is that the English reader is able to put herself in the picture of traveling to faraway places in a very believable way. And also, the interesting thing about this magazine is that the reader doesn't have to be wealthy or aristocratic. The opportunities for the heroines, it can be through work, so she doesn't have to be particularly rich to travel. So I feel like it makes the fantasy even more accessible. Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly what happened to the magazine, because I think it still exists as a website, myweekly.co.uk, and it still has serials presented in the form of feel-good reads. But if there are any magazine experts, please correct me as well. So in terms of similarities between the texts, I felt like the sexual threat was very present and perversely entertaining. There's a tension between beauty and backwardness. As I mentioned, the 18th century story normalizes the horrors of slavery. And in the 1920s version, a voice of warning comes through to describe the Sheikh as someone from a culture that has not caught up with their current one. So I quote, "He has got different ideas to the sort of men we know. It's up to you not to forget that. We didn't, but all the same, it was rather exciting, and it was exactly like a film story, only it was real life." So this idea of violence abroad while safety at home is being perpetuated. There's also a lot of beauty described. So in 18th century one, the heroine was described as a miracle of charms. The 1920s version really amplifies the glamour and commodity, describing the Sheikh as the most gorgeously dressed man I had ever seen. His robes were cloth of gold lined with rose-colored silk, and gorgeous is just used throughout the whole story. So I'm aware that with such a big time difference, it's not truly possible to compare without further contextualization. I do believe that these connections seem to indicate, for me anyway, the pulses of pleasure throughout the decades. I know that these publications are reflections of literary trends at the time, but I feel like the idea of feel-good, comfort, entertaining, domestic, ideals of feminine reading seem to be embedded in ideas of racial difference. I think that's pretty much it from me. Just wanted to say what I've been reading actually. Just finished this amazing book called When No One Is Watching by Lisa Cole, which is actually more of a thriller about gentrification, and it gets really scary, but it's actually got really good romance in there that nobody seems to talk about. I'm also reading The Duchess while They Courtney Milan, which is a classic Regency, and Dal A for Aunties, which is coming out soon by Jessie Santanto, and it's actually really hilarious. It's got a murder, a giant Indonesian Chinese wedding, and a group of Asian aunties who are insane, and the ex who's really hot and he got away. So I really love this book, so I just wanted to promote it. And I know Ali's got some really amazing recommendations at the end of her presentation as well. Yeah, so thank you so much.
Thanks, Pauline. That was really, really interesting. And we have had some questions come in, but I'm going to circle back to them at the end after Ali's done her talk, if that's okay with everybody. Ali, are you ready to go? Should I introduce you?
Yeah, I think I'm ready to go. Go for it.
So Ali is a romance writer, academic and editor, and she's currently at the University of Birmingham, and she's going to be talking to us about kind of the romance scholarship today, as Pauline said, how we can be more diverse, questions to think about. So Ali, take it away.
Okay. Oh, no, I don't want to do that. I want to actually share my screen. University of Brighton I'm at, not Birmingham, but sorry, I'm kind of jealous. I'm jealous of Birmingham's like incredible romance community. Okay, so has that shared? Is that brilliant? So I'm going to talk about popular romance studies and academic responsibility. These are some of the questions and some of the things that are coming up as I'm doing my own PhD research, particularly as I engage. I have multiple hats within the romance community, both as an academic. I'm a published romance author, which I still can't quite believe, and I also do freelance romance editing over a number of genres. So there are lots of questions that are raised and lots of discussions that happen in the romance community that I can't help but see impact the way that I approach popular romance studies as a whole. So this is kind of summarizing and sort of asking some of these questions. Okay, so first off, thank you to Pauline for the fantastic talk and for summarizing and explaining defining romance for us. I'm going to look a little bit briefly at popular romance studies. So we have three main waves of popular romance studies. The first wave, Tanya Modlewski and Loving with a Vengeance and Janice Radway's Reading the Romance, are what I call small samples, big assertions. They take a very small sample of books and make huge assertions about the entire genre based upon it. Modleski uses, I think, 6 Harlequin novels, and Radway uses historical romance novels. They are really important texts. This is a really young academic field, which makes it really exciting. And so even though there are limitations of these texts, and they can be frustrating when we read them, I may or may not have thrown Modleski across the room once, they are really important. These are the first books that actually turn around and said, genre romance in its current form, not in the classic Jane Austen, Bronte sisters form. Current genre romance is worthy of academic scrutiny. It's really important. Not unsurprisingly, the second wave was kind of led a little bit by Jane Ann Krentz, who led a defense of romance. Dangerous Men and Adventurous Women is a really interesting read because it is primarily made up of romance writers who are defending their genre against the assertions that it's all escapist and it's not very good for women. You know, if you read historical romance novels as escapism, you know, it could be damaging, which I think we all know, as there are many of us here who read romance, it's probably not quite the case. And then we come to the third wave of popular romance studies, which is sort of highlighted by Pamela Regis's A Natural History of the Romance novel in 2003. And here we start to see more focused readings of the genre, people focusing on books or selections and not trying to make assertions about the whole, but actually interested in what it is that specific books, texts, authors can tell us about society, about writing. There is analysis of both the social and contextual implications of romance, but also the Laura Vivanco book looks at the literary art of Harlequin, Mills and Boon romance. Both language and narrative are analysed in different ways, and that's really exciting to see. And as Pauline mentioned, the new companion for popular romance fiction, which the video thing is hidden for me, the Routledge Research Companion to Popular Romance Fiction is a must. It's also like £33 on Amazon, which is infinitely cheaper than the nearly £200 tag for the paperback or hardback. So if you want to have a look at it, and also I know that it is definitely, you can definitely request to look at specific chapters via interlibrary loans at the moment online. Really important. Another thing that I would also recommend is the Encyclopedia of Romantic Fiction. As Pauline pointed out, it's really hard, especially if you're studying romance, to make assertions about, you have to define everything. And it is difficult to do that without being able to quote from other people who are also saying these things. So it is really, those are really sort of key texts that we use as academics to sort of ground out research. Speaking of which, research responsibilities. So this I kind of summarized in 3 key questions. How and why do we choose our primary texts? We're, as popular romance studies, we are not necessarily literature academics, but we are narrative academics. We're interested in looking at romance within different mediums. So what is it that spurs us to choose specific texts? Why is it that we are looking at this? One of the big questions that I find myself asking more and more is the balance between traditional publishing and indie publishing and self-publishing. These different, they're all publishing the romance novel, but they're all doing it in very different ways and often for very different audiences as well. How are we thinking about that? And also, are we only referring to cis, straight, white, abled academic interpretations and theories? If we are only looking at the voices of people within our own sphere, then we end up in an echo chamber. People I would recommend looking at, so Jayashri Campbell and Su Ming Teo are very fantastic romance specialists, but also Bell Hooks, Moya Bailey, Margot J. Hendricks, Consuela Francis, Lavelle Ridley are all, and I can type up that list at the end, are all academics who are looking at gender studies or looking at narratives and how different groups of people are working. When we're looking at our text, we shouldn't just look at everything through this straight, cis, white, abled lens. And it's really easy to do so when most of the reading lists we have center those voices. But also the other question I have is one that makes me really think. If romance is rebellious, and I argue that romance can be rebellious, not that it always is, but a genre that can center the sorry, I echoed myself. A genre that can center happy ever afters for marginalized identities, for people who don't usually get to see themselves reflected in media, is really important. And if romance is rebellious, if it's doing this disruptive, almost punk work, then surely romance academia should be doing the same thing. As a young academic field, we were kept out of academic spaces for so long. When I started my PhD, which was 3 years ago, I'm doing a part-time PhD, I remember one of the academics at my university who I worked with in a different capacity, just went, "Oh, but aren't all romance novels the same?" And I kind of looked at them and laughed when I consider the hundreds of romances, if not thousands, that are published every single week. They are not all the same. But we finally have our foot in the door, as it were. Romance is actually at the table. So if we are at the table, then surely we have a responsibility to disrupt everything that is the norm. We have a responsibility to also bring with us the people who don't quite have a seat at the table yet, or who are being kept at the door. And I feel really strongly about this. It bleeds over into teaching responsibilities a little bit, where the university I'm at the moment has a big push to decolonize the curriculum and queering the curriculum. But part of that is not just going, I'm going to have a queer workshop week, or I'm going to have a Black romance week. It's about using diverse text throughout the modules, not just for token diversity sessions. It's about making sure that we are looking at the narrative and the structure and the language of texts, and not just focusing on the marginalized identity aspect of it. Those are important, and of course there should be nuanced sessions that look at those aspects of the novels, but that's not the only thing. When you're reading a romance novel, you're reading a romance novel. It doesn't matter whether it's Black or it's queer or has disabled characters. The romance is the center. The other aspects of it are important in terms of the author's identity and in terms of how we engage with the wider world, and they are disruptive. But to only look at them in terms of their marginalization is to do the writers a disservice, I think. And in the same way, when we're setting reading lists for students and setting reading tasks, we should also be boosting diverse critics and academics. We have an opportunity, and I'm aware that not everyone here has that opportunity right now. Like I'm lucky to have some teaching opportunities sometimes, not everyone does during their PhD, but when you do, it's really important to lift up everyone else. One of the things I love about popular romance studies, about IASPA, the International Association for the Study of Popular Romance, is how inclusive it is, how everyone helps everyone else. If you have a question and you ask, people will look, they will try and find quotes for you. We have discussions together. I have felt more a part of an academic community that for me exists almost entirely online than I have for academic communities within my university, because it exists in a very different way. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. Take a big deep breath. Sorry, I keep on going straight on. So my research, this sort of summarizes my current research. So romance is already recognized for its subversive potential, both in terms of authorship, readership, and narrative conventions. This potential can, but does not always, challenge the phallocentric nature of binaries, a fact which has often been embraced by romance readers, authors, academics, and cultural critics. But it has often been undermined by the assumed, and that's really important, the assumed formulaic nature of the genre's structures, conventions, and most importantly, its language. So how can a genre that is so reliant on these conventions use language as a way of opening up bisexual writing in a way that utilizes Sissu's theory and makes it accessible? I'm doing a creative writing PhD. So part of my research is writing a novel, and part of it is writing a thesis, but not as long as some other people might have. So 50,000 word novel, 30 to 35,000 word thesis. And I'm also looking very specifically at paranormal romances. This is the bit which I find quite interesting, because I'm not sure of all the answers to all of this. And which is why I thought it's kind of this is the perfect space to sort of bring them up. These are my research conundrums, the questions that I'm constantly asking myself, and I'm not sure I have all the answers just yet. So how can I make assertions about what romance can do? It's really important, I think, for me to highlight the fact that romance can be racist. It can be homophobic and transphobic and misogynist, and it can be really damaging, but it can be rebellious. And I think it's important to make a differentiation between the two. It's very easy, and it is often said, oh, romance is feminist because it's dominated by women. But highlighting that then ignores a huge portion of the queer community that really engage with romance, and also men as well. And our non-binary and gender fluid siblings. So it's important to highlight what it can do, but trying to make those assertions is really difficult, because I only have 35,000 words maximum. My supervisors want to make it 30. Trying to make assertions about what romance can do in that kind of space is really difficult. So I've had to think really carefully about the text that I want to shine a spotlight on. I've made the decision that all of the texts that I use as primary texts, and I'm going to use 2 key texts and then 2 more to back them up, will all be written by authors from marginalized identities. I'm not going to be engaging with that aspect of I'm not going to be engaging with the marginalized identities. That's not what I'm looking at. But I think it's really important to me to show that this is being done everywhere, and not to use texts that are often used regularly. I want to use texts that people may not have heard about, or are indie or self-published, because there's some really interesting work that's going on there that often gets ignored or forgotten about. One of the big questions I have is, how do I challenge Sisu's focus on cis womanhood in my own work? I chose Sisu as a theorist and as a way in because I really like the idea of écriture féminine, but I also chose Sisu 3 years ago. And as I've been reading more and more and researching more and getting to know her more and more, her focus is on cis womanhood. She talks about the female body, and she has a very narrow vision of what that is. That's not something it's not something I believe, and it's a question of how it's too late to change it. I've done research for 2-3 years. Like, I'm at a point where if I turn around to my supervisor and said I'm changing the way I'm accessing it, they may actually cry. So I have to look at how do I marry my my belief in intersectional feminisms with her focus. One of the ways I'm doing it is I am going to make sure that one of the texts I use has a trans woman, because even just having a trans woman as a heroine and not engaging with, is she a woman, is she not a woman, that's not a question for me. Of course she's a woman. Is making a statement, and it is quite a big statement. The feminist community, and a lot of what I'm doing engages with feminist theory, is split, and there are some trans exclusionary radical feminists, or who consider themselves to be gender critical, who have very, very loud voices. So by centering a trans woman as in one of my key texts, I'm attempting to make a statement to go, I don't really care what you say. They deserve to be included and accepted for who they are. I also want to make my research accessible. I'm writing about romance novels, genre romance. I want people who are romance readers and not just academics to engage with what it is that I'm doing. I was really excited to see some romance readers I know from online join us today. I feel like these are just the discussions that we're having in academia should be discussed more widely. I think we need to make them more accessible for people. How I'm going to do that and pass my PhD, I'm not sure, because I can write an accessible novel, but you know, the writing style for my thesis, there are different ways of interpreting how I'm going to do that. I'm still developing a voice that I am happy with and my supervisors are happy will pass. There is a conflict that I'm constantly in as a romance writer and a romance editor I underwrite, I don't waste words. And PhD, where you're supposed to expand everything, like I'm told, write longer sentences. I'm like, the sentence that lasts a paragraph is just confusing and bad writing. So this is but it's very important to me, and I'm really excited to see that this talk today is going to be available online as well. And then why does my research matter to me? I think this is a question we should all be asking ourselves, no matter what we're researching. And it is something we should come back to. Why is it that we are doing this research? Why is it that we're doing this work? I started off doing it because I kind of wanted to defend romance. I love romance and I was fed up with everyone putting it down all the time. It's still the case, but you know what? I think I'm at a stage where I don't really care anymore. I'm not fussed about defending romance. I want the research I do to be available for those who are interested in it. If you're closed-minded and think that all romances are, torn bodices and that people are still writing, all romances are still the shake, then you're wrong. And it's a question, I think, I'm not sure what the answer is to that. I know why it matters to me. It's deeply personal. I think romances are rebellious and political, and they give me hope. And I think if I'm going to spend 5-6 years of my life studying something, why not make it about hope? I'm going to finish off by sharing some romance recommendations. There are a number of them because it's me and I get overly excited about sharing awesome authors and people. I will be sharing the slides in a thread on my Twitter, which is CLA Aficionado. I'll pop it in the chat. So if you want to come grab them, don't panic about trying to write everything down urgently. So starting with reading recommendations. So Black Romance with Christina C. Jones, who is a self-published romance author, and Reese Ryan, who primarily writes for Harlequin. South Asian Romance, Alicia Ray and Salika Snyder, who have both done a mix of traditional and self-published or indie publishing romance. Southeast Asian Romance, Ruby Lang, who's indie published, and Jackie Lau, who is self-published primarily and newly indie published. Latinx Romance, Rebel Carter and Aidan Thomas. Aidan Thomas writes YA Latinx romances, but Cemetery Boys was so damn good, I just had to include it here. African Romance, Kirute and MP Barya, sorry. First Nations Romance, Pamela Sanderson and Lani Went Young. And Jewish Romance, Stacey Agden and Shira Glassman. Trans Romance, May Peterson and E. Ottoman. Romance, Liam Livings and Kay Sterling. FF Romance, Elliot de Bodard and Olivia Waite. Polyamorous Romance, Katie Robert and Holly Trent. Non-binary Romance, Chelsea M. Cameron and Anna Mardell. Asexual Spectrum Romance, Cole McCade and Jay Emery. And Aromantic Spectrum Romance, Candice Harper and Amy Eslin. Aromantic Spectrum Romance, these ones are structured as romance novels, but there are aromantic spectrum relationship novels that are structured like romances but aren't quite romances. Claude Arsenault, I think, is one of those, and it's a fantastic book, really interesting. I think I'll have to double check the name, but it takes the traditional romance structure and structures it for a platonic relationship. It's fascinating. And then finally we have Disabled Romance by Stephanie Simpson and Zan West. Neurodiverse Romance, Talia Hibbert and Brooke Winters. fat romances by Olivia Dade and Marie Lipscomb, and I use the term fat there as a neutral descriptor. Seasoned romance, Sandra Antonelli and Catherine Lundoff, and mental health romance, Therese Behery and Ellie Williams, and yes, that is me. Okay, I think I've kind of got through that. I can take a breath now.
Thanks so much, Ellie. That was amazing. And I'm sure I saw some people scribbling down the recommendations, so I feel like they will appreciate the Twitter thing. I'm going to start with the questions now, if that's okay. As we're going along, feel free to type more in the chat, or if you want to pop up and ask your question yourself, just let me know and we can make that happen. So I'm going to go back up. So we have our first question from Katrina, and I think this is directed to Pauline. She's asking, the ladies' magazines look fascinating. What year were these published until? And I think you covered this briefly, but I just thought I'd do it again.
Yes, so thanks. 1770 to 1847, and the My Story Weekly is 1927, and I'm not really sure what happened to it in print form, but it could still be existing as a website.
Okay. So then we have a question from Evie, and it's, I think, again directed to Pauline. It says, do you know what kind of ads or story/text framed those stories? What was on the adjacent page? Evie, you might have to clarify here exactly which magazines you were talking about here.
Yeah, I was referring to My Weekly stories, because I saw that the picture where the story begins with that little drawing of the woman on the bed.
Oh yes, I actually meant to explain that other picture, but I'm actually really happy that you asked that question about ads, because I'm currently writing about that right now. The ads I find really fascinating, especially in the My Story Weekly, because it could just be because they're vintage ads and the images look really cute to me. But there's this recurring ad for Egyptian foam powder or Egyptian foam cream, which seems has the same illustration of the story, and it seems to promise sleek, silky, soft skin and beauty. And I can't help but feel like it's just the same as the story, and it seems to be describing the product in the same way it's describing the men in the story as well, because, well, the clothes that they're wearing, because they're always wearing silky, luscious, luxurious fabrics. And I feel like the ads seem to be sort of perpetuating that you can get this too somehow. And there's also another ad for bobby pins, or I think bobbin pins, I'm not sure if it's the right name, which isn't orientalized, but it seems to be perpetuating this idea of film story beauty, in which you put these pins on, you can have, it actually says you will have successful love life, and you look like an actress. And yeah, it's really hilarious. And yeah, actually, can we just quickly share my screen again so I can explain that picture you mentioned? So you mean this one, Evie, My Night in Her Harem? Yeah, it's just another story. That's basically the same type of story. A woman travels for work, not part of a dancing group. She doesn't say exactly what job it is. And yeah, she just captures the attention of the Eastern man. He's obsessed with her, and yeah, she just tries to find a way out, back to safety.
But thank you very much. I was just interested because when you mentioned those magazines, I was thinking of even today, like Cosmopolitan and that kind of magazines. You have an article, something as supposedly, to use Ali's word, rebellious, like, oh, how you can have beautiful skin without spending any money on products. And then the next page has a really expensive cream, and you know how one connects to the other. So I was just wondering what they have, like how they construct this sort of feminine through the stories and through the products that they're peddling. Thank you.
Okay, so the next question we've got is from Amy, and she says, it's fascinating that the stories are advertised as told by the girls themselves. Why do you think there is a desire for confessional or autobiographical stories rather than fictional ones within the desert romance genre?
Thanks, Amy. I'm actually really happy that you asked that as well, because it's something I'm trying to figure out, because I feel like there has been an obsession for authenticity right from the 18th century. For example, stories by an author called Penelope Orban, which I'm looking at, always has stories written by Charlotte Dupont, for example, is the name of the character, told by her and what happened. And I feel like it's sort of continuing this theme right into the 1920s. I guess one obvious answer is maybe just fueling the rumor, gossip, and scandal. The fact that it can happen to you at any time. It's happened to others, it can happen to you, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. You might want to indulge in this. Yeah, so that's my explanation for now, but I think there is more, which I'm trying to figure out.
Cool. And so we've got another question for Amy, but this one from Amy, but this one directed at Ali. So Amy's asking, how can those of us who are more established or more secure in the romance or pop culture research community support newer or more precarious members?
I mean, when I was applying for my PhD, and I think I just tweeted about being a bit concerned about, like, what the hell, how do I put a proposal together? I mean, you, Amy, I think possibly Laura and Eric Selinger, like, all reached out to me and went, hey, I'll read through your proposal for you, like, I'll help. And there were a couple of other people as well. I really, really appreciated that. And I think there's a listserv, which if you're interested in romance, in romance academia, I definitely join, where emails go out and we kind of talk as a community about different things. There were tons of emails when the RWA disaster was happening. Gosh, was that last year already? Yeah. It's a really great group. There's the Facebook group is also quite handy. How can we support? I think part of it is I would argue by one of the things I'm doing by including diverse texts in all my teaching as a matter of course. It makes it easier for people who want to do a similar thing or who want to study those books to realize that that's okay, you can do that in an academic setting. One of the students I had who I did a session on an option module for their second year, and they said that the reading list I'd given them was the most diverse reading list they'd had in their entire time at university, and that was scary to me. that should not be the case. It is, I think, when we are in a literature, I often work in literature or creative writing fields, often there is a focus on Victorian or Elizabethan literature, but there are queer writers, there are writers of colour, there are disabled narratives. And if you were looking at older texts, then thinking about, like, if you're looking at Austen, don't just use white critics don't just look at white critics analysing her work, or use straight cis theory as a way in, because those who are established, who have tenure or have permanent positions in university, you guys have the opportunity to start showing your students, as well as sort of us coming up in us postgrads, that they can diversify what they're doing. I feel really quite strongly about it. Last year, there was a student who said that they were studying Jane Eyre and they'd never heard of White Sargassosi. They hadn't looked at race. They hadn't looked at the queer narrative. They hadn't looked at feminism. And I obviously didn't critique anyone else because everyone comes at things from different angles, but was vaguely horrified. But when I said, oh, what about White Sargassosi? One of the students came and said, oh, it's okay, miss. What we've done is we've set up a Decolonising the Curriculum reading group set up by students. And I was like, wow, when the students are doing that work, then we're clearly going wrong somewhere. Yeah, but also it's difficult because it's all about funding as well. What can you get funding for? What can we persuade heads of departments is worth spending money on? Like, the fact that they're agreeing to focus on romance is a big enough deal in the first place. It shouldn't be that way, but it is. Like, that, having a romance module is a big deal, especially in this country. It's more common in the States. So I don't know. I'm not sure I gave any kind of answer to that. Does that help at all?
I think it helped. I mean, Amy, maybe it was your question, Amy, but I think it was a good answer. So the next question we have is slightly easier, and Pauline, Ali, either of you can answer, both of you can answer. What are some upcoming romances you are looking forward to? Oh, and I didn't say this one. There you go.
I'm really jealous that you're reading Dial A for Aunties, because I am dying to get my hands on that book. Like, that looks amazing.
Oh, yes. I think we should all look forward to this one. I only just finished it a few days ago. I managed to get an advanced copy. I think I was just hooked on the first description. It is a bit morbid. It's about a woman who gets set up on a blind date, and she accidentally kills her date, and she just panics. Involves her mum, and involves a bunch of her aunties. They get trapped in a giant wedding, and she runs into her ex, and it's just a riot, and I really recommend it.
Really excited about that. I've got just got an advanced copy of How to Find a Princess, which is the next book in the Runaway Royals series by Alyssa Cole, which is a lesbian or FF romance, which I'm really excited about. And I'm also really excited to see some more of the new Talia Hibbert books that are going to be coming out. The spin-off the Sweetbriar Austen retelling spin-off series from her Brown Sisters trilogy. In terms of more indie romance, May Peterson's The Calyx Charm, I am so psyched for. It's one of the only currently published romances with a trans woman heroine, fantasy romances with a trans woman heroine in it. Like, you can find plenty or a number in contemporary. When it comes to paranormal or fantasy, that is the only one that is still in print. There less than 3 had one, but that's no longer available. And there's another one forthcoming, possibly from J. Emery, which I'm quite excited about. But like, Calyx Charm is such a huge deal. So I'm basically telling everyone to go read it. And it's one of those covers I had on my slides. Like, it is stunning. Like, it's beautiful cover. Sorry, I kind of took over there, Pauline. Take it away. Any others you're looking forward to?
These are already out, but I've fallen in love with Evie Dunmore's work. I read, what's it called? Oh, my mind's just gone blank. But Bringing Down the Duke, which I think it's a classic Regency, but I found it amazing. And I think she's got another one and another 2 in the works. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Well, I think we've got some great chat going in the chat. That sounded pretty weird to say, but I can't see any more questions for our panelists, and it is now 6:30, so I think I'll wrap up unless anyone's got any questions they want to ask in person or anything that's just come to their head. We will have time for one more question if people do want to ask anything. Okay. Oh, Evie, you've waved your hand. Oh, and we've had Laura. Okay, I'll go to Laura and then I'll go Evie. So Laura's asked, was Dunmore the author who wrote the book which had the white hero with the Hindu god tattoo? Yes, okay, that's been answered in the chat. Evie, what's your question?
Because I just started my PhD as well. I'm a first year and I'm part-time, and I'm also working almost full-time. What I wanted to ask is, like, every conversation I have with somebody who studies the romance, you are constantly like talking about all these books, and I wonder how you manage to find the time to keep up with the genre that is so diverse, and so many books are coming out constantly, and it's kind of overwhelming. And it's like, and I was talking to Amy about this as well, like, because of studying and working, and I found that I'm reading a little bit less as well. So how do you manage to read everything that's coming out and everything that has already been published, and still searching and finding new voices and trying to be diverse? So any like tips or anything?
I mean, set yourself a budget, because I don't, and that's the reason I'm broke at the end of every month. I'm lucky that I read super fast. Like, I can sit down and read a book in 2-3 hours easy. It is difficult, like, finding that balance. Whatever you're doing for your PhD, don't try and read everything, because it's not possible. I have thousands of books on my Kindle, all of which I declare I will get round to reading at some point, I just want to inject them directly into my veins because I need all of these books. But if you've got a specific focus that you're interested in, focus on that. Whether that's you're looking at a particular, I think Jayashri mentions like picking a niche in a time period. If you want to read to expand around your focus, work out what that focus is and how narrow you want to make it, and then you can it gets easier. And ask for recommendations. Like if you're on Twitter, because that's where I usually get most of mine, people are really friendly. If you hashtag Romancelandia and go, or hit me up if you want specific recommendations, that's probably the best way to go. What's your topic?
Representations of the female body in popular romance in certain subgenres. So because it is that, and I'm looking at paranormal, and I'm looking at big beautiful women, and I want to look at sort of the more eco-conscious kind of texts that go into sci-fi. So at the moment, I'm probably have bitten more than I could chew. So like female body, like how, and I'm thinking that, and because I've been thinking what you said, trying to be more diverse and thinking of like disabled bodies or trans or so instead of making it more limited, I'm actually, the more I read, I realize that, oh, I have to read about this as well, and I have to include this, and I want to include that. And
I mean, there are limits to what you can do in a PhD, but you can always point to further research you want to do. Like this isn't, your PhD isn't a, right, this is my research and that's it for the rest of my life. It's a point, it's a jumping off point, which I'm sure like people who actually have PhDs can explain far better than I could. But yeah, it's a jumping off point. So don't feel like you have to cram everything into this. Like when I started, I gave my supervisors a list of 12 books. No, 26 books that I whittled down to 12, and they were like, no, you can have 2, we can possibly have 2 extras in there. It's like, but there's everything, I need to reference everything. Yeah, but enjoy it. Like you've got this time to do this research and do this reading, and give yourself reading for pleasure time as well, like, because otherwise it's so easy to burn out, and you don't want to get bored of reading romances. Like that would be the most horrendous thing.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the advice, and for everybody on the chat for the advice. I will do that, Romance Lady, and yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, so I think I'm going to wrap up here, unless Pauline, you wanted to add anything to Ali's answer.
Yeah, just agree with what Ali says. I mean,
Sorry, I
it's
kind of
really
went
hard to keep up with all the recs, especially your ones, Ali. But yeah, I've actually started listening to audiobooks now, because sometimes I just get so drained at the end of the day. I can't even read the words through my eyes. I'm just having to like process them else. But romance audiobooks, I feel like could be another topic for another day, because I find I'm a bit, I know I've spoken to you, Ali, about this. They're a bit of a hit and miss sometimes. I've listened to all of Talia Hibbert's books as audiobooks, and some are good and some are a bit cringy, but yeah, maybe talk about that later.
Okay, so I just want to say again, thank you to our wonderful speakers, Pauline and Ali. Your talks are very interesting and definitely sparked some discussions and things I'm going to take away and apply to my own research. As always, thank you to everyone who came. And if you do want to check out our website, Dan has very helpfully put the links in the chat to our network, and you can become a member. We are also currently recruiting for our next committee. So if you want to shape the kind of course of the network and the events we do and plug more romance research with me, feel free to check out the website and look at the available spots we have open. And